When we study a catastrophic failure, whether that is like a bridge collapsing into a river or a massive global empire fracturing into dust, there is a documented traceable trail of decay.
Right, like a slow fade. Yeah.
Exactly. You can sift through the wreckage and find the rusted bolts. The ignored stress fractures, the gradual erosion of the structural integrity. The collapse makes sense because the degradation was already happening beneath the
But
surface.
for sure, it's never just spontaneous.
But when you step into the very beginning of the human story, into this pristine, perfectly engineered ecosystem called Eden, there is no rust. There are no stress fractures. We're looking at a catastrophe that happens in a state of absolute, unblemished perfection. I mean, it is the ultimate locked room mystery.
It really is. It's the absolute definition of a flawless system being suddenly and violently compromised from the inside out. We're not watching a gradual decline here. We are watching a sudden terminal infection enter a completely sterile environment. Welcome to the deep dive. We are so glad you are here with us today. You are listening to Between the Verses, where curiosity meets scripture, and I am your host, Daniel Moreau.
And I am Hannah Moreau, the analytical half of this sibling duo.
So this is the official third episode of our show. It marks part 3 and the grand conclusion of our current series, Between the Verses, Unpacking the Beginning.
And because this is the finale, we have a staggering amount to unpack. I mean, theological, historical, psychological ground. We have to cover it all. We are wrapping up a narrative that literally defines the current human condition.
Yeah, so this deep dive is intentionally going to be longer than the previous two. We need the space to properly analyze this entire sequence of events. If you have not yet listened to parts 1 and 2, we strongly encourage you to go back and do so. They are available right now on YouTube and Spotify, and I promise you, you will not regret it.
No, you really won't. They establish the crucial framework that you absolutely need for today.
As always, just a quick reminder of our core mission here. Everything we are discussing today comes directly from our personal, individual Bible reading and our study notes. Our ultimate goal is to encourage the text to be a real, living, breathing part of your daily life.
Right. We do not want this to be viewed as just, an old book of ancient scrolls that somehow magically survived a few millennia.
Exactly. We want you to see the absolute brilliance and the terrifying relevance in these pages. Today, we are looking at the climax of the Genesis tragedy. We're exploring the exact anatomy of the temptation, the intense biological and spiritual shift that occurred, the literal fraction of a second the fruit was consumed.
The massive heavenly audience watching it all unfold, too.
Yes. And finally, the permanent exile from Eden.
So to truly comprehend the gravity of that moment, we really have to pull all the way back. We have to look at the cosmic power dynamics at play before the adversary even approaches the humans. Because the stage is set in a way that completely defies modern Western assumptions about the hierarchy of the universe.
All right, let's examine that hierarchy because it is wild. God creates humanity from the absolute baseline elements of the earth. The Hebrew word used is Adama, meaning the soil, like the red clay. He breathes life into this mud, and then he does something entirely unprecedented.
He imprints them.
Exactly. He imprints these soil-based creatures with the imago Dei, his own image, and then he hands them the keys to the entire earth, giving them total sovereign stewardship over the terrestrial realm. But while this coronation is happening, there is an audience watching from the spiritual realm.
The heavenly host. The angels. And, you really have to put yourself in their perspective to understand the profound disruption this caused. We carry this cultural baggage of angels as these soft, glowing figures with feathery wings playing harps on clouds.
And baby cupids.
Yes. We have completely neutered them in our art and literature. But when you look at the ancient Near Eastern context and the biblical text itself, angels are majestic, overwhelming, and frankly, terrifying entities.
Oh, absolutely. Anytime they pull back the veil and show themselves to a human, the human response is immediate visceral panic. The very first thing the angel always has to say is, do not be afraid, because the person on the ground is usually like hyperventilating or completely catatonic.
Right. You're talking about beings described in books like Ezekiel and Isaiah as having wheels of fire, multiple faces, wings covering their bodies, radiating this intense, blinding energy. I mean, they are beings of immense, unfathomable power dwelling in the direct presence of the Creator.
They're pure spirit.
Pure spirit, ancient, and highly intelligent, and then God scoops up a handful of earth, literally the lowest, most basic material in the physical universe. He shapes it, but he does not give the angels his image. He gives his image to the dirt.
Wow. Yeah. The angels, with all their terrifying majesty, look completely different from the Creator. But these fragile, soil-based, finite creatures actually bear the visual and spiritual imprint of the Almighty. It's a stunning reversal of expectations.
It is. And to add to that shock, God tells these mud creatures that they are now the vice-regents of this beautiful, pristine new world. It is an incredible elevation of status. So for certain members of that heavenly host, including the entity who would eventually become known as the adversary, this sparked an intense breeding jealousy and a deep-seated pride.
I have often tried to find a modern equivalent for this, just to wrap my mind around the sheer indignation of it. Imagine like an incredibly highly trained, terrifyingly powerful corporate executive.
Okay, I like this.
Right. This person has been with the company since before the foundation was even poured. They help build the infrastructure, they operate at the absolute highest levels of power, and they possess a staggering intellect. Then the CEO brings in a completely naive, dirt-covered kid off the street with zero experience, zero resume, and announces, this kid is getting the massive promotion. He's the new head of the earthly division simply because he bears my family resemblance.
The executive would be absolutely furious. The pride would just boil over into total resentment. They'd be thinking, I possess the power, I possess the intellect, I am constructed of higher, purer material. Why are they being elevated above me? It is a massive affront to their sense of meritocracy.
Exactly. But that jealousy does not manifest as a childish tantrum. It manifests as a highly calculated, strategic, and patient study of the target. These rebellious entities did not just rush into the garden blindly.
No, they watched.
They watched humanity from the very beginning. They studied their routines, their reactions, the limitations of their physical forms. I mean, this was a masterclass in behavioral observation.
They were trying to figure out how to manipulate and influence these creatures on the deepest possible psychological and spiritual levels. They were gathering data. But this highlights a fundamental theological distinction we must always keep in mind. The adversary can study human behavior.
Yeah.
He can observe patterns, identify psychological triggers, and use that accumulated data to influence us. But the adversary does not possess omniscience. Only the creator truly knows the human heart through and through. The enemy is making highly educated, mathematically probable guesses based on ancient surveillance, whereas God sees the absolute, unshielded core of our being.
That's such a good point. The enemy has the behavioral analytics, but God wrote the source code. So the adversary uses those analytics to plan a highly targeted strike. And the strategy of the approach is fascinating when you consider the state of Adam and Eve at that moment. We often throw around the word perfect, but what does that actually mean in this context?
Well, their brains functioned flawlessly without any genetic decay, and their bodies were completely unblemished by disease, but they were not omniscient.
Right. They were completely lacking in attained wisdom. They were entirely naive. They had zero lived experience of deceit, manipulation, malice, or danger.
None at all.
Their intellect, while functioning at maximum capacity, was nowhere near the ancient cosmic level of the angelic beings. They were brilliant, flawless minds, operating without a single defensive firewall, simply because they had never needed one.
Exactly. So the adversary chooses his target carefully. He approaches Eve. He does not approach Adam first.
Which is key.
It is. She is the youngest of the two. She was created after Adam, meaning she had technically been walking the earth for a shorter amount of time. She had the least amount of life experience, even within the context of perfection. The enemy did not attack their physical perfection. He exploited their lack of chronological experience.
It was a deeply calculated move to isolate the one who had not heard the original command regarding the tree directly from God's mouth, but rather secondhand from her husband.
Yeah, and the logistics of this moment get incredibly tense when you look closely at the Hebrew text. Genesis 3.6 contains a phrase that has fueled centuries of debate. It says that Adam was with her.
Oh man, this part.
Right. The Hebrew word is ima.
Yeah.
What does that actually mean in that physical space? Was he standing shoulder to shoulder with her? Was he a few yards away?
See, it changes the entire complexion of the narrative. If he is standing in her immediate vicinity, listening to this ancient cosmic entity actively twist the words of God, and he does absolutely nothing to intervene, that is a catastrophic failure of his covenantal stewardship right out of the gate.
It totally forces us to ask where his attention was directed. Was he completely distracted? The garden was overflowing with complex flora and fauna. Was he examining something nearby or perhaps just passively listening while this incredibly consequential conversation was happening?
Okay, let's unpack this, because I struggle to accept the idea that he was just a passive bystander. Are we saying Adam was just standing there like a bump on a log? The text notes that when she took the fruit and ate it, she gave some to him, and their eyes were opened together. The phrasing implies a shared, simultaneous event.
It wasn't a delay.
Exactly. It was not a scenario where she ate the fruit, went on a mile-long hike to find him, and offered him a bite hours later. The immediacy implies a very close proximity.
The immediacy of their shared realization strongly suggests he was right there, and that leads to a profound psychological inquiry about Adam's state of mind. When Eve handed him the fruit, what was the internal dialogue? What was the verbal exchange? Did he ask probing questions? Did he say, wait, is this from the tree in the center of the garden?
But the text is hauntingly silent on his response. It simply says he ate. And the psychology of that moment is something we still see replicated in human behavior. Think about modern infatuation, where someone will do absolutely anything their partner asks, ignoring all logic and established rules.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Adam had spent a significant amount of time alone before Eve was created. He had named the animals, observing that every creature had a counterpart, while he had none. He had experienced a profound existential solitude. And now he has this flawless, perfect partner. We have to consider if he was so entirely captivated by her, so terrified of losing this profound connection, that he willfully ignored the established boundaries of reality simply to remain in solidarity with her.
That is a staggering concept. Was there any pushback at all, any challenge to her logic? Or was his desire to align himself with her so overpowering that he took the fruit without a second thought? The silence of Adam in this narrative is deafening. He abdicates his role as the guardian of the garden. He allows the boundary to be breached without a fight.
Which brings us to the mechanics of the lie itself. Adam's potential silence and Satan's smooth-talking lead us directly to the lie that changed humanity forever. And it wasn't some complex, multi-layered philosophical argument. It was a terrifyingly direct, blunt contradiction. The adversary looks at Eve and boldly states, "You will not certainly die." He outright calls the Creator a liar.
We really need to pause and recognize the sheer, unadulterated arrogance of that statement. Think about the entity speaking these words. This being had dwelt in the heavenly courts. He had witnessed the raw, unfathomable power of God bringing the cosmos into existence. He knew exactly what God was capable of.
Yeah.
And yet, he is brazen enough to look at God's newest creation and completely test the absolute truth of the divine decree.
But I have to wonder about his level of certainty. Did the adversary actually know for a fact that they would not die the moment the fruit touched their lips? Because the original decree was, "In the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die." The Hebrew phrasing is motemet, dying, you shall die.
Yeah.
Did God mean immediate biological cessation of life? Or did he mean the introduction of mortality, the slow, inescapable decay that begins the moment the boundary is crossed?
That distinction, immediate physiological death versus the onset of mortality and spiritual death, might have been a topic of intense observation among the heavenly hosts. The adversary was essentially banking on a technicality. He knew the physical bodies of Adam and Eve were highly resilient, vibrating with the sustaining life force of the Creator. He gambled on the probability that God's grace, or just the sheer biological perfection of the humans, would prevent an instantaneous physical demise.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The adversary is essentially the universe's first manipulative defense attorney.
I love that analogy.
He operates by finding the loophole. He looks at the wording of the decree, finds the ambiguity in how it might be executed, and convinces his naive clients to take the risk. Look, God said you would die, but I assure you, your heart is not going to stop beating the exact second you take a bite.
Yeah.
See? You are still breathing. He is withholding something from you.
He twisted the truth into a bold half-truth, and the terrifying reality is, in a strictly biological immediate sense, he was correct. They did not drop dead into the soil the moment they chewed the fruit. Their hearts kept beating, their lungs kept drawing in oxygen.
But that does not mean they escaped the consequence. Something else did happen immediately. It was a biological, psychological, and spiritual shock to the entire system. Genesis 3:7 details the immediate aftermath. It says, "Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked."
I want to pull in a different translation here to highlight the nuance of what is actually happening. The Amplified Bible, which is a translation designed to build extended definitions and nuances from the original Hebrew directly into the English text, adds a clinically fascinating phrase. It notes that their awareness increased. The veil of innocence was violently torn away.
Oh, let's connect the spiritual realities to the physiological reality here. Before this exact moment, they existed in a state of perfect harmony with their environment. Part of being spiritually and mentally perfect in Eden meant possessing a very specific kind of innocence. It meant they lacked a hypervigilant, threat-assessing awareness.
Right. And when you lack threat, you lack stress.
Hmm.
To understand the gravity of this shift, we have to look at the autonomic nervous system of the human body today. The modern world requires a highly elevated, almost constant state of awareness just to survive. We are constantly bombarded with stimuli, perceived threats, complex social dynamics, and existential anxieties.
The moment we wake up, our brains begin assessing risk. We are flooded with adrenaline just thinking about our daily obligations.
Exactly. And what the fields of biology and neuroscience have shown us about this complex machine that God designed is that this heightened sense of awareness, this constant vigilance, triggers a severe physiological response. It spikes our cortisol levels. When we perceive a threat, whether that is a physical predator or a psychological stressor, our bodies pump out cortisol and adrenaline to initiate the fight or flight response.
But the human body was never biologically meant to live in a perpetual, sustained state of fight or flight.
Absolutely not. High sustained cortisol levels wreak absolute havoc on our biology. It suppresses the immune system, it damages the cardiovascular system, it disrupts neurogenesis in the brain, it literally ages our cells at an accelerated rate, and eventually it contributes to our physical death.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? That rush of anxiety you get in traffic, or when you are checking your bank account, or the panic of a medical diagnosis, that physiological stress response is quite literally the biological echo of the fall. It is the physical manifestation of leaving the peace of Eden. God's original blueprint for humanity did not include this crushing, toxic weight of stress.
We were built for a peaceful, unburdened existence.
Exactly, completely sustained by his presence. But the moment their eyes were opened, that peace evaporated.
Their awareness increased, and suddenly their own biology turned against them. What was completely natural and unproblematic a few minutes prior, being naked in the garden, was horribly, uncomfortably unnatural. The shame hit them like a physical blow. For the first time in human history, they were looking at themselves and at each other through a fractured, critical lens.
The innocence was gone. They perceived themselves as vulnerable, exposed, and fundamentally flawed. And their immediate reaction to this overwhelming psychological trauma is fascinating. In their panic, they suddenly decide to sew fig leaves together to construct coverings for themselves. They suddenly knew how to manipulate their environment for the purpose of concealment.
Which represents a massive shift in their cognition. Were they taught practical skills like weaving and sewing by God prior to the fall as part of their stewardship? It is entirely possible. But another, perhaps more unsettling possibility is that this practical utilitarian knowledge violently downloaded into their consciousness alongside the shame.
Was it a veil lifting? Like waking up from the Matrix, suddenly knowing how to do things out of pure survival instinct. It is as if the sudden influx of vulnerability triggered an emergency response. They move from simply existing in perfect harmony with nature to actively manipulating nature to hide their own perceived inadequacies. They are suddenly problem-solving out of a state of fear.
And so, now equipped with the sudden, stressful awareness, elevated cortisol, and makeshift clothing, they are standing in the middle of this garden, confronted with two massive elephant-in-the-room mysteries regarding the garden itself: the trees.
We really have to deconstruct the mysteries of these trees, starting with the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. For centuries, theologians and scholars have debated whether the tree was purely symbolic, a metaphor for moral autonomy, or a literal physical piece of flora. But if it was literal, what actually was it? Because I think we need to permanently retire the image of the apple.
Yes, please. The apple is a cultural artifact, not a biblical one. The text never specifies the type of fruit. The association with the apple likely stems from a linguistic anomaly centuries later. When the Bible was translated into Latin, the Vulgate, the Latin word for evil, is malum, and the Latin word for apple is also malum. It was a phonetic pun that eventually solidified into Renaissance art and Western folklore.
Oh, wow, so it's literally just a pun. If we strip away the Latin pun, we are left wondering if it was a fruit we might recognize today. Was it a pomegranate, a fig, a cluster of grapes? Was it something entirely mundane that merely held a specific divine prohibition?
Well, many ancient Near Eastern traditions and early rabbinic writings suggest it could have been a fig tree, especially given that they immediately used fig leaves to cover themselves. Some suggest grapes or wheat. But honestly, the physical composition, the molecular structure of the fruit might be entirely irrelevant.
Right.
The knowledge was not necessarily contained in the juice or the seeds. The knowledge came from the lived experiential act of crossing the boundary into disobedience. By defining for themselves what was good and what was bad, independent of God's decree, they absorbed the knowledge through the action, not the digestion.
They seized moral autonomy.
Hmm.
But that brings us to an even more complex philosophical dilemma. The second elephant in the room, a massive hypothetical that forces us to look at the mechanics of the garden's rules. What if Adam had not eaten the fruit?
Oh, it is one of the most staggering what-ifs in theological history. We know Eve was deceived. The text in Timothy even reiterates that she was thoroughly deceived. But Adam was not deceived in the same way. He made a conscious, clear-eyed choice to join her in the transgression. What if he had held his ground? What if he had observed her consume the fruit, witnessed the immediate shift in her demeanor, and steadfastly refused to participate?
This is the ultimate fork in the road of human history. If Adam remains obedient to the covenant but Eve has fallen into a state of sin, what is the protocol? The fundamental rule of the garden is that sin and corruption cannot exist in the unmediated presence of God's holiness.
Exactly. It forces us to ask how God would have handled a divided humanity right at the starting line. Would he have removed the impurity from the garden, meaning the exile or destruction of Eve? And if so, would he have simply put Adam into another deep sleep, taken another rib, and constructed a second partner?
If Adam says no, does God just take another rib? Because if Adam says no, he preserves his own spiritual perfection and he maintains his direct communion with God, but he loses his partner. He loses the flesh of his flesh. How does the entire biblical narrative shift on this one hypothetical moment of marital conflict?
It highlights the unimaginable pressure of that specific moment. Adam deeply loved Eve. He was faced with an impossible binary choice. Side with the Creator and lose his wife, or side with his wife and sever his connection to the Creator.
It is the first and arguably the most devastating conflict of loyalty in human history. And Adam chose his wife over God. He chose the creation over the Creator. He chose solidarity in death rather than isolation in life.
But the hypothetical remains a hypothetical because he took the fruit. The boundary was crossed. And the immediate result was not a philosophical debate about the nature of free will. The immediate result was an interrogation from the Creator. They heard the terrifying sound of him walking in the garden in the cool of the day.
And this interrogation establishes a pattern of human behavior, a psychological reflex, that we still see perfectly replicated in our society today. It initiates the primal instinct of deflection, the blame game. God approaches them to ask what happened. He asks a series of piercing questions. And it's fascinating to analyze the specific order in which God conducts this inquiry. He does not address them as a collective unit.
No, he establishes a clear hierarchy of accountability. He starts with the oldest human left in charge of the earthly house. He starts with Adam. Adam is the one who was placed in the garden first. He was the one explicitly given the command regarding the tree before Eve was even formed from his side. He was the designated steward of this earthly domain. So God goes to the person holding the keys and asks, "Have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from?"
And Adam's response is a masterclass in blame shifting. The very first human instinct in a state of corrupted awareness is to deflect responsibility. Adam does not offer a contrite confession. He points directly to Eve, and subtly, he points the finger right back at God. He says, "The woman you put here with me, she gave me some fruit from the tree and I ate it."
It is astounding audacity. He essentially says, it is her fault for handing it to me, and ultimately it is your fault for creating her and putting her in my space. If you hadn't given her to me, this wouldn't have happened. He weaponizes the very gift God gave him to alleviate his loneliness.
God then turns his attention to the second in command, the younger human, Eve. "What is this you have done?" And her response is identical in its mechanics. She deflects. She points down the chain to the serpent. "The serpent deceived me and I ate."
The interrogation moves in the reverse order of the crime. Adam, then Eve, then the serpent. And after the inquiry concludes, the sentencing phase begins. The curses are handed down, and the harsh realities of this new, broken ecosystem are established.
When you consider that the environment is now fundamentally hostile, it completely recontextualizes the specific curses. Let us examine the judgment passed upon Eve, because it raises a very interesting question about the original physiological design. God increases her birth pangs. He tells her, "I will make your pains in childbearing very severe. With painful labor you will give birth to children."
The Hebrew word used there is itabon, which encompasses sorrow, pain, and grueling toil. If the pain was greatly increased or multiplied, it implies that there was originally some level of sensation or effort involved in the process.
Like on a scale of 1 to 10, what was the pain supposed to be? Just a 1. A mild pressure, like a dentist says.
Yeah, exactly. If we consider the agony we associate with childbirth today, perhaps the original design was entirely manageable.
Like a strenuous physical exertion, a monumental biological task of bringing new life into the world, but not the agonizing, life-threatening trauma it became. The introduction of sin weaponized the very act of creating new life. The biology of birth became fraught with peril.
But beyond the physical curses regarding childbirth and the painful toil of extracting food from the cursed ground, there is a monumentally significant action that God takes right before formally exiling them. They had covered themselves in flimsy fig leaves, this pathetic attempt to hide their shame. God sees this, and the text says he makes garments of animal skin for them, and he clothes them.
This is a detail that is incredibly easy to read past as just a practical wardrobe change. But when you truly think about the implications, it is a devastating new reality. Up until this very moment, humans and animals coexisted in absolute, unbroken peace. Based on the dietary instructions in Genesis 1, humans and animals were entirely vegan. They consumed seed-bearing plants and fruit.
The animals were our companions, our subjects in this kingdom we were tasked with stewarding. There was no predation, there was no bloodshed. So to acquire an animal skin, an animal has to die.
What must that have been like for Adam and Eve to witness? They had never seen death. They had never seen blood spilled on the pristine soil of Eden. And suddenly, God takes one of the creatures they were meant to protect, a creature they likely had a deep, peaceful relationship with, and its life is violently ended. Did the making of these skins signal a terrifying new reality, that killing and consuming animals was now allowed to cover their shame?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the theological concept of atonement begins right here, the Hebrew concept of kippur, to cover. This is the first shedding of innocent blood in human history. It sets up the entire theological framework for the rest of the Bible. The idea that human rebellion creates a debt of shame and guilt, and that debt requires a severe cost to cover it. The innocence and the life of the animal are traded to cover the guilt and the exposure of the human.
It is the absolute end of the peaceful ideal. It is the introduction of violence, death, and sacrifice into the human ecosystem. It's a terrifying new paradigm. They are suddenly wearing the evidence of their failure on their own bodies.
And as God hands down these devastating new realities, as the blood is spilled and the heavy skins are placed on their shivering bodies, we have to look closely at who is standing there witnessing this absolute humiliation. The instigator of it all is present for the fallout. We need to examine the identity of the enemy.
We commonly use the name Satan, but it's crucial to understand the linguistic background. Satan is not his actual name. It is a title. In Hebrew, it is Satan, which translates to the adversary or the accuser. It describes his function, his role in relation to humanity and the divine court, rather than his personal identity.
So what was his original name? The name he held before he became the adversary. The biblical text is intentionally obscure about this. In Isaiah 14, there's a prophetic taunt against the king of Babylon that uses language clearly referencing this fallen entity. The Latin Vulgate translation gives us the name Lucifer, which means light bringer, but the original Hebrew in that passage is Halel ben Shashar, which translates to shining one, son of the dawn.
Shining one. It connects perfectly back to the terrifying, radiant majesty of these angelic beings we discussed earlier. But why is his actual, original, glorious name obscured? Why do we only know him by his criminal title?
Because the overarching dominant theme of the biblical narrative is God's kingdom and its vindication. God intentionally did not want humanity calling upon the actual glorious name of the entity that caused such a massive earthly ruckus.
I think about the Roman concept of damnatio memoria, the condemnation of memory. When a criminal or a treasonous figure was condemned, the Roman Senate would literally chisel their name out of the history books. They'd erase them from the historical records to deny them glory. God essentially did the exact same thing to the greatest criminal in the cosmos. He stripped him of his title of Lightbringer and permanently reduced him to his function, the accuser.
He denied him the glory he so desperately craved. But even reduced to a title, the adversary was present. He watched the curses being handed down. He watched the humans recoil in horror at the death of the animal. And this brings us to one of the most mysterious, complex, and haunting verses in this entire narrative, Genesis 3:22.
God speaks, but he is not speaking directly to Adam and Eve in this moment. He says, the man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil. Who is the us? Who is God addressing here?
He is speaking to the divine council. He is addressing the heavenly hosts, the cosmic audience that has been witnessing this entire situation unfold from the spiritual realm.
The phrasing is so jarring. The man has now become like one of us. Was God being petty or sarcastic here? Like, look at the humans now successfully becoming like us.
I think it carries a tone of profound, tragic irony. The serpent promised they would be like God. They desired to elevate themselves to divine status, and in a twisted, broken way, they achieved it. They gained the knowledge of good and evil, but they acquired it through rebellion. They grasped the knowledge, but they entirely lacked the infinite wisdom, the purity, and the capacity required to handle that knowledge without destroying themselves.
Imagine the atmosphere in that moment, the absolute suffocating shame Adam and Eve must have felt. They are standing there, clothed in the bloody skins of animals, their perfect home ruined, their bodies pulsing with unfamiliar stress hormones, and they know that all heavenly eyes, including Satan's, are watching their complete humiliation.
The psychological torment of that moment is almost incomprehensible. The awe of the angels turning to sorrow, the adversary watching the full extent of the collateral damage. And God knew that having obtained this broken, corrupted knowledge, humanity could not be allowed to remain in a state of eternal physical perfection.
Genesis 3.22 continues with a terrifying realization. God says, "He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever." This brings the second tree into sharp focus.
The tree of life. If they had managed to scramble over to that tree right after eating from the forbidden tree, the consequences would have been catastrophic on a cosmic scale. If eating from the tree of life sustained their physical bodies indefinitely, eating from it in their newly fallen state would have meant immortalizing their corruption.
They would have lived forever in a state of perpetual sin, alienation, and psychological decay. They would have become eternal, unredeemable monsters, trapped in a broken biology forever. God's expulsion of them wasn't merely a punitive measure, it was a necessary quarantine. He had to sever their access to physical eternity while they were infected with sin, so that mortality could eventually pave the way for redemption.
And so, the humiliation reaches its absolute peak not just in words, but in a terrifying physical expulsion from their perfect home. God exiles them out of the garden. And to ensure they can never ever return to access the tree of life, he establishes a terrifying security perimeter.
He officially marks their state of sin, defined as disobedience to God's laws and commandments. They are now imperfect, deeply ashamed, and guilty. And he places cherubim on the east side of the Garden of Eden, and alongside them, a spinning sword of fire that turns every which way to block the way to the tree. Let us paint a clear picture of this, because again, our cultural artwork has failed us. What are cherubim in the ancient Near Eastern context?
They are definitely not chubby toddlers with tiny wings. In ancient Near Eastern iconography, cherubim are composite, sphinx-like creatures. They are fierce, warrior-class spiritual beings often depicted guarding the thrones of deities or kings. They are the ultimate cosmic bouncers, radiating power and enforcing divine boundaries. You can compare these two guarding angels to the stoic guards at Buckingham Palace, permanently stationed, totally unmoving.
And they're accompanied by a flaming sword. The Hebrew phrase refers to a flashing, devouring flame. It is often conceptualized as a spinning, kinetic vortex of fire, acting as an impenetrable barrier. Picture the sheer terror of a sharp metal ball of fire acting as a barrier. It is violent, it is unapproachable, and it is absolute.
Flanking this vortex of fire are the cherubim, holding the line between corrupted humanity and the sanctuary of paradise. Their sole purpose is to thwart any attempt by Adam and Eve to breach the garden.
Imagine losing your childhood home, but instead of just handing over the keys, there's a literal tornado of fire on the front porch, keeping you out forever. A home where every single memory is perfect. And it makes me wonder, did Adam and Eve immediately hike miles away into the unknown? Or did they camp just outside the garden boundaries?
Oh, wow.
Like endlessly peeking into the paradise they lost. Just sitting in the uncultivated dirt, spending endless nights watching the terrifying rhythmic glow of that flaming sword. Knowing that the perfect climate, the perfect peace, the unbroken communion was just a few hundred yards away, but completely permanently inaccessible.
The psychological weight of that proximity would be absolutely unbearable. This physical barrier represents the spiritual reality of sin. It is the architectural manifestation of their state. Because they crossed that boundary, they were now fundamentally incompatible with the holy space of Eden.
The physical exile from the geography of the garden was just a reflection of the spiritual exile from the unmediated presence of God. They were entirely cut off. And this brings our deep dive and this entire three-part series to a profoundly heavy conclusion.
It really does. We have synthesized a massive cosmological journey today. We started with perfect, dirt-born stewards, given the ultimate privilege of tending a flawless world.
And we end with stressed, biologically compromised, deeply ashamed exiles stepping into a world with no established laws, no societal structure, carrying the heavy, crushing burden of sin.
It is the tragic end of the beginning.
And that officially wraps up our Between the Verses, Unpacking the Beginning three-part series. We have covered the creation of the cosmos, the intricate geography and theology of Eden, and now the catastrophic fall of mankind.
But the human narrative obviously does not end outside those flaming gates. Humanity has to figure out how to survive, how to multiply, and how to relate to God in this brutal new reality.
Which is why I am incredibly excited to build some anticipation for our next series. I want to announce the title right now. Between the Verses, the beginning of humanity outside Eden. Are you guys ready for this? Because things get extremely interesting.
Oh, it is where the human story, as we currently recognize it, filled with violence, innovation, tragedy, and hope, truly kicks off.
As we close out this deep dive, we want to leave you with a brand new, provocative thought to mull over based on the source material, something to explore on your own that builds on the incredible complexity of what we have discussed today.
Think about those cherubim, the ancient, powerful entities posted at the east gate of Eden, flanking that spinning sword of fire.
What were the actual conversations like between those two angels posted at the gate of Eden with the flaming sword? Think about their perspective. They had watched humanity's creation from the heavenly realms with absolute awe. They witnessed the manipulation by one of their own kind, an entity who fell to pride and jealousy.
And now, as a direct result of that cosmic tragedy, these magnificent beings were permanently assigned to act as wardens. They were stationed to guard the tree of life against the very humans they were originally meant to serve.
How did they view Adam and Eve as they watched them take their first shivering steps into the untamed wilderness? Did they feel pity? Did they feel anger? Next time you feel the painful sting of a consequence in your own life, remember the cosmic audience that watched the very first consequence play out and the flaming sword that finalized it.
We want to remind you to subscribe to the show so you do not miss the start of our new series. Keep opening those pages, keep asking the difficult, complex questions, and keep exploring Scripture with genuine curiosity.
Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. We will see you outside the gates next time.